This coalition is an alliance of organizations and individuals coming together to support and advance electrification in buildings. Decarbonizing buildings is essential to meeting California's ambitious climate goals and to improve our air quality in our homes and for our health. We advocate for local governments in the San Diego region to achieve carbon neutrality by moving away from natural gas consumption in both residential and commercial buildings. I want to thank all of you for coming today. In today's webinar, we address methods to successfully advocate for and implement local building electrification policies by covering different approaches, the unique steps and resources needed, and the timelines for each process. This webinar is being recorded. Colleen, do you have that going?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. The recording will be available on the SDBEC YouTube channel in a few days. We'll send out a link for that. Then as to moving on to some of the practices we use in Zoom, rename your Zoom name using your pronouns if desired. We have wonderful information to present today, so please cooperate by remaining muted during the webinar. For your questions and comments, please enter those directly into chat. For clarification questions, we attempt to address these during the webinar while the speakers are presenting. Others we address towards the end of the webinar. Josh Jean is with us today to attempt to address some more of the technical questions in chat. For more technical questions, you can use our Google form. Let me put that into chat. I can find my chat window. Our team will follow up on these more technical questions in the coming days. Today, we're standing on the ancestral lands of the Kumeyaay people. They're the original native inhabitants of San Diego County who lived in this region for more than 10,000 years. Historically, the Kumeyaay were horticulturalists, hunters, and gatherers, known for being some of the best and earliest environmental managers in North America. Along with their other native lands, the land of the Kumeyaay was stolen by the United States government. Today, we pay respect to the Kumeyaay elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us here today. Next up, I want to introduce our speakers or let them introduce themselves. Doug.
Hi, everybody. Doug Cott. I am an architect, urban planner, building scientist, have been doing sustainability related work for more than 23 years at this point. My experience with the REACH codes that we're going to talk about is a couple years long now, and supporting Peninsula Clean Energy and Silicon Valley Clean Energy in their broad REACH code efforts, including their technical assistance program. I am based here in San Diego, and I'll pass it to Amy Dryden.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Good evening, everybody. My name is Amy Dryden. I'm with Association for Energy Affordability. I'm not based in the San Diego region, but it's raining up here, so maybe I wish I was. I am Director of Strategic Innovations here, and I have been in the industry for over 20 years with a background in construction, doing residential, new and remodel, and that got kind of coupled up with city and regional planning and environmental planning, mashed up with anthropology, and all that has put me kind of working in this industry to advance it to have more sustainable, healthier housing. And I have worked with local governments on REACH codes since, I would say, the last heyday of these ordinances back in the late early 2000s, when there was a whole slew of green building ordinances. And so now we're in this kind of new era with a new goalpost and a new paradigm. And so happy to be here with you this evening.
And next up, Mike.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Mike Grimm. I work with the City of Carlsbad. I've been there for a long, long time. And similar to Doug and Amy's career, I've been able to work on a lot of different things. I am not a scientist, though, and you'll see that in my presentation. But I have done a lot of land use planning, housing policies, habitat conservation, and as you'll hear, the City of Carlsbad adopted a climate action plan a few years ago, and I was lucky enough to become their CAP administrator. So besides administering the climate action plan, I also do some climate adaptation work, and I'm on the board of the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative, and have seen many familiar names in the participants list. So welcome, everybody. Glad you can make it.
Thank you, Mike. Next, we'll cover the basic agenda outline for today's webinar. We're going to have a section that covers history, background, concepts, and pathways. And Doug Cott will be presenting that. And then in the next section, we'll cover steps and defining success, and Amy will be covering that. The third section is the Carlsbad example, and Mike will cover those issues. In the closing section, we'll present resources, we'll address questions and answers, and then we'll do final calls to action. And again, thank you so much for being here. I will stop sharing so that Doug can start his presentation. And we will make all the slides available in the following days. We'll combine them into one and send out the information to you. Doug, are you ready? You're on mute.
Doug, you're on mute.
Awesome. There we go. So you guys can see my screen all right, I take it?
No, you're not sharing yet.
But we can hear you now. So, you know, there you go.
Good. How about now?
Yes, perfect.
As many times as we practice, it doesn't always work. How about now? You can see and hear? Brilliant. That's already better than it was a minute ago. Great. So my job today is to just kind of queue up some of the kind of high level topics and let Amy and Mike kind of get into the details. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through a bit of the background, you know, kind of very brief history of electrification, some of the drivers and issues around this, the kind of reach codes and some of the other related issues and policies that come up. And then we'll talk very high level about pathways, and Amy's going to take us a little bit more detailed into that. And then we'll have some advocacy and engagement pieces for each of our presentations. And at the very end of Mike's presentation, we'll share some resources with you as well. So, so very brief history of electrification. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, so I am obligated to reference this back to Ben Franklin. And so the good thing to know is that all of the technologies we're talking about as it relates to electrification, this is all state of the shelf stuff. Much of this has been around since pre-Civil War. So the heat pumps that we use for space heating, for water heating, old technology, nothing new there. The transportation pieces on electric vehicles, the photovoltaics, all of the equipment we're talking about has decades of reliability and use. There's a lot of different waves to this. You know, early versions of electrification were about getting electricity into rural homes, and now it's more about this decarbonization efforts. Something that's fun to know is this is not even the first time that we've been down this electrification pitch. I happen to collect memorabilia. If you're looking at the screen there, I have one of these medallions. But in the late 50s, Ronald Reagan was actually the spokesperson for all electric homes, right? So this is a very, you know, believe it or not, we've been here before. So, but it's important to know kind of what the drivers are for today. You know, this is broad in its scope. Geographically speaking, New York City looking at retrofitting of existing buildings for all electric, the state of California, of course. I am an architect, and so the American Institute of Architects offers the continuing education on building electrification. There are many states currently that have or allow natural gas bans, and we'll talk a little about that as one of the pathways. Cities like Brookline in Boston or in Massachusetts Seattle just banned the city council action a few days ago. So lots of activity around this broadly. But of course, California is one of the big leaders. And we're going to hear a lot about the efforts of the Bay Area today. And of course, Mike's work in Carlsbad as the lone southern dot on that map. But this has applicability in affordable housing. It has applicability kind of very broadly across the state of California. So let's talk about some of those benefits. These get talked about a bunch. I'm going to kind of go through them maybe with a little bit different perspective than what you've seen before. But there are obvious climate benefits. That's our focus. The health benefits become one of the key talking points. Safety is another part of that as well. And then there's some cost aspects that we'll talk about a little bit, and then we'll kind of share some additional stuff in the resources later. So the emissions piece. This is a US-based emissions. Things are roughly a third: buildings, transportation, industry. But when you look at sort of even the materials that go into buildings, buildings are more like half of the emissions profile. The good news is, as we clean our electricity, the legacy emissions that will come out of our built environment are going to be from transportation and building gas emissions, right? This is why electrification, this is why REACH codes, this is the stuff we're talking about. This is what matters. As electricity gets cleaner, so this is a future looking profile, transportation and building gas use are the environmental problem. So let's talk about that, right? We have, historically used electricity from coal, and that was driving global warming, acid rain, smog, lung cancer, and asthma, right? So we've gotten kind of off of coal, at least in California, and now we're sort of in this natural gas phase, which is still pushing very hard on our global warming problem. And of course, our objective is to get to full electricity powered by solar, wind, and hydro. And so natural gas was, kind of put out as a bridge fuel to get us from coal to clean, renewable energy or electricity. So the important thing is there's really nothing natural about this, right? So we should get off of the idea of using natural gas as a term. It's methane, period. And it turns out it's a big issue when we combust it, but it's even worse when it leaks. And there are a lot of leaks in our gas system. So the math on this is, 10 times worse for global warming to leak a therm than to burn a therm on a sort of long-term basis, 100-year basis, but it's more like 84 times the impact on a short-term basis. And we're already past the point of no return. So in a little, just kind of look at that leakage issue, have a sense of what the emissions are associated with a house, for example. When we start to look at some of the studies and the data on leakage, we see that different parts of the system for gas distribution and even coming all the way into your home, there's leaks all throughout the system. And those range somewhere between 5 to 10% of total system losses. So what we know about industry leakage rates, that we are underreporting methane emissions for a GHG impact by about a 3x factor. So this is not showing up in your climate action plans. This is not showing up in the conversations. This has been an emerging area of science and research that's really pushing us to need to make this transition off of natural gas even faster. From an ambient air quality standpoint, in the state of California, our buildings are emitting about 107 tons a day of nitrous oxides, which is roughly equivalent to about the light duty vehicle emissions. So this is kind of an important issue. Most of our electricity comes from natural gas, so we've really reduced down a lot of this impact, but there are a lot of other combustion fuels that happen in heating buildings. So this is why it's still a lingering issue. We talk about it from the environmental climate standpoint. This is now from an ambient air quality standpoint, which affects asthma and health especially. Indoor use of gas has huge impacts as well. We focus on children often when we talk about health. There's lots of reasons why, but the use of natural gas in a home is a really pretty significant indicator around asthma for children. So lots of stuff there. Just a quick note about resiliency as a sort of safety issue. In our climate, where we have earthquakes and wildfires, first off, gas is the first utility shut off and the last to be restored. Gas equipment doesn't generally work without electricity. The fan that pushes hot air into your home is on electricity, even if you have a gas furnace. Your water heater in California, so if you have really old stuff, you might still be able to operate, but you're already got real danger issues associated with that. So from a resiliency standpoint, gas isn't getting us there. The better option is to be all electric, look at battery storage, and make that transition for your home and for yourself. The other thing, of course, that we know is natural gas is a significant fire ignition source. It causes half of earthquake fires are tied to natural gas. That's why we turn it off first and turn it on last. So if you're in the East Coast in blizzards, that's a different story. You may need heat to get through, but for California's purposes and our disasters, there's no resiliency gains from gas. Electricity is your answer. From a kind of a cost perspective, now this is not relative to San Diego. This is some work that we've done for Peninsula Clean Energy and Silicon Valley Clean Energy, looking at overall capital costs of buildings and where the savings comes or goes, right? And the biggest cost savings comes from the no longer having to pay for gas service and meter, huge capital cost savings there. There's other aspects of capital cost savings in the home itself too. And then from an operating standpoint, some of these appliances may operate at a slightly higher cost. Most of them operate at a lower cost due to the increased efficiency of electric appliances and equipment. So we're going to conduct this work for San Diego and have something similar. The kind of important thing to note is an all-electric home saves money from a capital cost standpoint. And while the energy will be roughly neutral, if you were to invest your capital cost savings in extra solar, you can significantly reduce your operating costs from an electricity standpoint. So just a quick note about that idea of affordability, because this does come up and it tends to be one of the issues that's debated at the state level. Affordable housing and electrification. So probably the best indicator, I would say, of both the cost effectiveness of this, and you're going to hear a little bit more about cost effectiveness studies. There's the one I just showed you was a consumer looking cost effectiveness. Then there's this sort of required process at the state, which looks at kind of a cost effectiveness using a formula that we have to do when we want to pass a code. But related to that, there are other agencies within the state that are now bringing electrification into their conversation. So this is a new language from the California Strategic Growth Council, where they had formerly offered points in their tax credit allocation and their funding models around green buildings. They're sort of diminishing the role that like green building certifications may play and increasing the significance of electrification. So for the 10-point category on green buildings, 7 of those points are now tied to electrification on a going forward basis. So this is an indication that at the state level, we're having interagency conversation around what it's going to take to electrify our building stock. Also kind of related, there's a part of our building code that talks about energy, and then there's a part that talks about broader sustainability. And things like electric vehicles show up a lot in that, it's called Cal Green. It shows up in our REACH codes, or within Cal Green, there are tiers that are possible. And a lot of communities are pushing REACH codes around electric vehicles to help meet and get ahead of the market need. And in San Diego County, we have decent adoption of electric vehicles, but our codes right now don't even keep up with the electric vehicle demand that we have in our homes, in our buildings. So it's a channel for REACH codes. We're not going to talk too much about that today, but know that electric vehicles are governed by Cal Green and a different part of our building standards codes, not the energy code. And so I'm putting it in here as like a related topic. So let's talk about REACH code pathways. There are lots of different options here. The most common ones we'll kind of refer to, sometimes it gets talked about as police power, sometimes it gets talked about as land use code, but it's really this idea of municipal authority. Basically, a city gets to pass its own laws around health and safety. And I'll walk through these a little bit for the next few slides. The energy REACH codes is kind of our emphasis today. And again, my job is just to touch on it a little bit. There's some different versions of that that you'll hear more from both from Amy and from Mike as they get into it. And then there's action at the state that can happen. And then there's another angle around our air quality, or California Air Resources Resources Board approach. So let's start with this municipal authority and land use. By the Constitution of California, cities have police power granted to them to basically protect the health, safety, and welfare of their communities. So this is sometimes referred to as a natural gas ban or a natural gas moratorium, typically associated with new construction. Sometimes it can come up in existing as well. That's a different conversation, but for now we're talking about it relative to new construction. It uses police power, no new gas hookups. It's very difficult politically to pursue this, but a number of notable cities have. Berkeley was the first in mid-2019, San Francisco, Morgan Hill, San Jose was about the biggest one through October. And then Seattle, as I mentioned, from council action just this week. Other cities across the US are looking at this, the entire state of Massachusetts. I'm supporting the city of Cambridge right now, and they're looking at their now. Preferred ordinance, which creates.
Hey, Doug.
Yes.
You just froze for a minute. Can you maybe turn off your video for a little while?
Sure, happy to do that.
Not a minute. You froze for like 5 seconds.
Oh, got it. Okay, let me stop video, see if that helps. Good. The reach codes tend to take two different forms. There's an all electric option and then sort of an electric preferred. So depending on the, I would say, the courage of your city staff, both and looking at the state codes in what the 2022 version of that will look like. And there's some direct advocacy that's happening. And this is going to be one of your calls to action to kind of at least be informed about what's coming with the building codes. The air quality resource boards. This is a different set of conversations that are happening that are looking at how we may limit the use of natural gas in buildings due to health, and ambient resource boards operate under different rules, with different rules across the state of California. And there's quite a bit of conversation happening around what that might look like from a natural gas moratorium perspective, but using a different agency and a different lens to look at that. So I'm going to close with a couple of advocacy kind of concepts and ideas, things that sort of worked in the conversations that I've been a part of across the state. So, there's a lot of work that needs to be done engaging different sectors. So you've got your design community, your business interests, your neighborhood communities, any kind of green building or sustainability related task force, the youth and kids is an important part of that. There are single issue advocates around things like affordability or labor or other pieces that are really important there. So coming up with a strategy around who you're going to speak to and how you're going to do that and what your talking points will be really is very important. The consistency of messaging is, I would say, an important lesson learned. A great deal of education, through the supply chain is needed when you start getting into this. That safety message is a really important one. The idea of there's some emotional attachment to things like cooking. So we want to kind of understand that and make sure when you're doing advocacy around this topic, you're finding the right messages for the right audience. So, definitely some good options in terms of what that looks like. I would say, key messaging points that are always good to be thinking about is the improved air quality, the cost savings, better public health. That's really kind of the piece of it that I think is most important. When you get into the advocacy work, the potential of what's there, discussion around local opportunities. If you need to summarize technologies, that's available. There's a lot of work to translate the statewide cost effectiveness and what does it mean, and understanding those impacts. And so just to really finalize this before I pass it to Amy is, key, if there were three things I could leave you with, right? It's like burning methane in our buildings is a huge public health and climate threat. All electric buildings offer significant health and environmental benefits. All electric buildings utilize state-of-the-shelf technology. This is cost-effective today for new construction and increasingly for existing buildings. The biggest and most important step is to don't make this worse, right? Don't invest in infrastructure that's going to have a lifetime of problems for you, your home, and your community. And we can do all this by implementing REACH codes. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing, turn my camera back on, and hear what Amy's got to tell us about going a little deeper into these topics I just had to touch on. Let me figure out how to stop share.
Great. Thanks, Doug. All right. So with that kind of framework, let's dig into some more details. So can you guys see okay the slides?
Yep, looks
Yes,
good.
Amy.
Thumbs up. Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to take you briefly, like Doug laid out the landscape. I'm going to pull out just a couple of highlights in that. Then just give you an overview of REACH codes and talk about what we're seeing out there. What's that process? Because it is a structured process, whether we like it or not. And then go through the different opportunities and talk about some examples of the way we can approach it, because it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And think about affordability and the different kind of aspects of the process and just overall approach. And I think that will then kind of give you that framework and set up where Mike can bring us home with, local specific example. So just setting the stage, Doug set it up nicely, but we're in this shifting landscape right now where we're not just talking about energy efficiency, right? We're shifting to GHG emissions, and it's creeping in, and it's less creeping now and kind of taking some leaps and bounds into our legislation. In the past 8 years, we've had a slew of legislation that has passed to look at reducing greenhouse gas emissions in our existing buildings and our new construction buildings. We've got carbon neutrality by 2045. This year, we're going to have 2 programs, SB 1477, Tech and Build, that are market transformation programs solely focused on low carbon space heating and water heating, which is awesome. Like, things are definitely shifting. And so that's just a good thing to note, to be able to leverage these other activities when we're thinking about different market actors and what needs to happen locally. You can also understand what's happening statewide. I put this up here just as the context. I really like reading about the codes. Not everybody really likes reading about the codes, but the codes get updated every 3 years. And so just for reference, we're stepping through this process, and carbon neutrality 2045 is not that far away, right? We had residential Z&E in our 2019 code. By 2020. We're looking at 40% reduction, 60% clean energy in commercial Z&E by 2030. And so when we start thinking about these REACH codes and all this local activity, it's really doing code readiness and paving the way to ensuring that we're hitting these targets that we have in front of us. So that's just some broader kind of like super high level policy and code stuff I wanted to touch on. The next 2 slides are just some context for you. There's a lot of people doing amazing work throughout the state on this. And just 2 pieces I want to pull out. One is a framework from GridWorks on the gas system transition. So there's a number of things in here. They definitely touch on low income community and bill protections, protections for renters. And so part of it is kind of a larger framework for what we want kind of the state to undertake and kind of be able to kind of push down into all of our local communities, but it's a place also to look at to see what can we do at the local level as well, to raise up these issues, as well as greenlining put out equitable building electrification. And again, it's a really nice framework in terms of assessing the community needs, establishing community-led decision-making, developing these metrics, ensuring support and funding, and improving outcomes. And so those can be brought into, those are part of the REACH code process as well, kind of those steps as well. But I just wanted to point those out as just good references to help us frame our approach to it. So we are addressing it comprehensively and equitably, because it's a really important issue. So with that, let me get into some of the activities. So I put up here 4 calls for action. I'm going to focus on the last one, right? Of course, adopting above code standards. That's why we're here to talk about reach codes. But I wanted to say there's different ways we can interact, right? We can have more efficient national standards. You'll hear about federal preemption, and it kind of limits what our energy code can require. And so by pushing on national standards and having those kind of align with market conditions and market products and technology, that allows us to also move forward. So there's that avenue if that works for you. Just improving compliance with our adopted standards, that's a benefit to all of us because we get the efficiency and the greenhouse gas emissions that we're actually targeting. We can push up to the state, like Doug was saying, for the 2022 standards when we're looking for heat pump water heater baseline. We're looking at electric rate structures. We're looking at all electric baseline for non-residential. So all of these things, when you have better standards at the state, that gives us more flexibility and opportunity to build on those at the local level as needed. And then, as I mentioned too, above code standards, and that's where we'll spend most of our time. So what are the benefits? Doug talked about, they're really tools to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? And advance climate goals. Mike already mentioned he's leading the CAPS, so we'll hear about that. Doug also touched on the kind of the healthier and safer homes, right? Particularly when we're talking about electrification and removing combustion appliances from home, we're creating safer and healthier environments. We're really focusing on buildings today or this evening, but there's bundling that's happening. So we're seeing greater adoption of EV and PV as due to reach codes, greater economic benefits. And so, but with this, when jurisdictions are undertaking this process, there are certain requirements. So number one, they must exceed the state requirements, right? I can't adopt something that's sub building code, state building code, right? The building code is our worst case scenario, worst building we're allowed to build. It must be cost effective, and I'll talk about what that is in a moment. It cannot require higher efficiency than the federal minimum levels. So I was talking about earlier in terms of that preemption. And you can justify it with these particular local conditions of why we need to go above a code to respond to specific geographic, topographic, or climatic conditions. So there's this structure we have to go through to kind of defend it and create the rationale for it. And when folks are doing that, there's a number of different considerations, right? We have these aggressive goals. The local governments can take action with support of external stakeholders and parties. But then you have to think about how are we going to pursue this? And I'm going to talk about some examples, so we'll get into this more, but is it mandatory or voluntary? Are we talking about new construction or existing? What's happening in this particular area? What's coming across the permit counter that we really want to impact? Is it public development or is it private development? It's going to vary, and I'll show you some really amazing examples of why you may choose one over the other. Is it commercial or residential, right? I talk with a number of jurisdictions who are like, don't even talk to me about single family. We've got none of that. Talk to me about commercial and multifamily. Other folks are like, only talk to me about single family. That's what we see day in and day out. Doug also talked about kind of triggers of land use permit versus building permit. What's that kind of triggering point for compliance? And how are we approaching it? Whole building, or I'm looking at single measures. So there's a number of considerations to make sure that you're addressing your community for the best impact, right? What information do I have available? What's happening in my community? What are those characteristics? What's my building type? What comes across the permit counter, and what resources do we have available to do it? And so you look at that kind of Venn diagram right in the middle, and that's that kind of sweet spot that you want to be thinking about. Because this is the process you have to go through, right? And I'm saying you, and it's the broad you. I know a number of you are not kind of, you're not employed by a jurisdiction, but if you're working with them, which I'll talk about that partnership, you want to make sure you understand this process. So as we're doing this, talked about some of the requirements that you need to have that cost effectiveness study. That's your backstop. That's your legal, like, yes, I can do this defensively and it will pass. Then the jurisdiction's going to go through all these number of steps to make sure there's enough stakeholder engagement and first reading and second reading and staff reports, right? So building internal and external support for it, and ultimately submitting it to the Energy Commission for approval. Then it will be adopted by City Council, and then it's good to go to set for an implementation date. So there's a number of very structured steps that have to be met and submitted for approval. So these cost effectiveness studies, Doug was saying, like, you know, they're written as cost effectiveness studies. Very few of us really like to read these. I read them. I don't always like to read them, but there are our defense, right? There are backstop that says, like, yes, it meets all the requirements that the Energy Commission says. And so nobody can kind of come to you and say, you can't do this. What we then do is we take these cost-effective studies and we figure out how to translate them. And I'll talk about the translation in a minute. But what I wanted to put up here, at least for your reference, and you'll have the slides of like what cost-effectiveness studies exist now. So we can address single-family new construction and retrofits, multifamily, low to high-rise, non-res, battery storage. And when we talk about cost-effectiveness, they're demonstrated in two different ways. They're not always cost-effective in both ways. One is time-dependent valuation, which is the social cost of energy according to the CEC. We'll put that aside over there. And on-bill customer-based cost effectiveness, which that's usually the most kind of, it resonates the most with people and is the most meaningful. But both of those methodologies are in there, and as long as it's cost effective for one, you're good to go. I put this in here just so you can see, like, well, we want to address some other building stock that's not in here. Here's the list of cost effectiveness studies that are coming out with the dates. And so that's an opportunity to plan ahead based on what's most important to your community. Okay, keep track of my time. So I mentioned, like, well, let's do this translation. Like, how are studies being leveraged? Like, what are jurisdictions doing with them? So a couple of things, I'll show those examples, but like I said, they're using them to meet climate action goals. They're developing all electric or electric preferred ordinances, requiring above code requirements for mixed fuel projects, really to figure out how much to put the finger on the scale to essentially drive voluntary selection of all electric, right? We have PV requirements where they're not required for new construction. Under our new code, PV is required for low-rise residential, a minimum amount. And I didn't put it in that bullet there, but they're also bringing in EV infrastructure. So this little trifecta on the right-hand side is really what we're seeing now as kind of a new whole building approach. Like really when we see these synergies of, I would say, operational cost effectiveness kind of come together. When I have an all-electric building, I have EV, and I have on-site generation. And it's this really nice complementary approach for cost effectiveness from an operational standpoint, as well as I would say a construction standpoint too, if we're talking new construction. So what do these look like? Doug talked about a number of these, so I'm going to go kind of quickly. Again, we can have I want to make sure there's time for conversation because it's most important. Like eliminating gas from gas moratorium to an all electric reach code. In the all electric reach code, sometimes folks will have these various exceptions of specific building types or still allow outdoor gas fireplaces, right? They may have electric preferred. That's why I was talking about putting your finger on the scale to figure out which, how much more stringent can we make mixed fuel? So it's still cost effective, right? But folks are going to kind of lean toward doing the all electric. And so, some of these go from like very politically hard, but have a large impact to more flexibility and kind of less guaranteed emissions. So that's something to think about. But it really is important to think about that political will. And if this is the first time out of the gate, you have to think about what's happening in the community, what's happening in the jurisdiction, and how can you be effective. At the bottom, I put building stock because I think a number of them can be adjusted for new as well as significant rehabs. Several jurisdictions have adopted kind of new construction ordinances and then applied them to 50% rehabs, which is, I think, awesome. But I'm also not doing those rehabs. So electric ready is a great way for pre-wire if you need that. And then there's things that on an emissions limit or kind of eliminating fossil fuel based on a phase out date, and it can be by a whole building or appliance level. So there's a number of different options there. And with over 42 jurisdictions in the state having adopted ordinances, You can see they're kind of covering the spectrum here from the mixed fuel option that I was talking about to all electric, but they may have some specific appliances in there, right? Like they may allow cooking in home, or they may allow backyard fireplaces, things like that. Kind of a gas ban or all electric with really no exceptions. So we're kind of seeing that spectrum, and it's really been kind of paving the way and building a lot of momentum for many jurisdictions across the state who are dipping their toe into this and trying to figure it out for the first time. And when you're figuring it out for the first time, I would say it's like finding a pathway to win. You don't have to take it on at all, everything all at once. It's not a 0 to 100, but you want to win, you want to make some progress, and you want some impact, right? So again, you're thinking about what's my trigger, what's that land use? Is it a land use permit? Is it a building permit? I'm going to try to get a lot of entitlements. Is it code enforcement, right? You can think about these other different pieces. Make sure you have a really good metric. Is it energy efficiency? Is it greenhouse gas emission? Am I really looking at just eliminating fuel type? And then I'll quantify that. Is it green building certification or some other certification? You want to make sure you have that metric, because that ties to your trigger, and it ties to the type of building you're going to do. Your target should be based on what's going to have, what do you have the political will to do, and what do you have that's going to have that impact, right, within your city. So I'm going to take you through kind of 3 different examples of how different folks have addressed this. And one is going from like a small geographic scale and then going to a larger full jurisdiction scale. For both the examples I'm talking about, it's like their first ordinance. And so one on the left you can see is Alameda up here in Northern California. This is a place where they focus on geographic, and they said we're doing all electric and all city-owned land. Well, like over 70, I would say 90% of their new construction is going to happen in Alameda Point, which is the old naval station, which is getting turned over to the city. And so 90% of their new construction will have to comply with this. And so they're able to do that without dealing with the remaining 10% that's privately owned. So super smart move, great impact. And made progress. The other one is a small city in the Bay Area. In 2004, they integrated a reach code into their specific plan for a new parcel that was being built out. And that was really easy. And then over the years, they expanded it, and now they have an all-electric new construction for the entire city. So again, it's just thinking about these varying strategies. I'm trying to keep those. Okay, the next one is voluntary to mandatory. So I've worked with jurisdictions all throughout the state, and there's some where there's a lot of economic concern. There's a lot of very strong foothold from developers, number of different considerations. And so for those jurisdictions, we talked about creating incentive-based requirements where it's that carrot of you can have additional floor area ratio, you can have additional height or density, right, to go all electric. And so again, it becomes a choice because that bottom line switches when you give these carrots. And then over time, you can move to mandatory, right? And so you can gradually expand kind of the building types you address, and then again, move from voluntary to mandatory. Again, just thinking about what you have to navigate and what's a strategy to get there. The other one, this is a jurisdiction I was working with recently. They said, well, we can adopt an all-electric construction ordinance, and we're going to put in, I think I only included 7. I think they have like a little kind of nuances, and I think I actually went up to 9 exceptions. But that was going to get them through. They're actually planning a 9-month update where they're removing a couple of those exceptions to make it required for affordable housing. Then they're going to be removing the exception for entitlements. And then they're doing, I put in the 18-month update. That's my made up timeline. But they have this kind of phasing program where they adopt it with these exceptions, and then they're going to start simplifying it over time to make it more broad. But this is the way to get it passed and start action today versus trying to cover every single building in this jurisdiction and get things shot down because it was too challenging. I think I'm doing okay on time because I only have like 3 more slides. So those were a couple examples. So the last couple of slides, I just want to give a little bit more context. One is affordability. So as you all are working with the jurisdiction, there's affordability on their side. I showed you that, that arrow of the process of the REACH code process. That's not an insignificant amount of work. The statewide IOU REACH code process has done cost effectiveness studies, has done model template ordinances, has done sample staff reports to support jurisdictions to reduce that required time to comply with this process and get something passed. But just know that takes a lot of time and effort to do the stakeholder engagement, work with the city council, et cetera, and move things through. So there's support to try to get that done, but we want to make that kind of more affordable. We want to make sure that compliance is affordable. So not just the cost effectiveness study, that's that checkbox that says, okay, it's defensible, but the constituents, the stakeholders, the developers, they all can be like, okay, this makes sense. I can do the compliance. I'm not going to spend, 20 hours doing paperwork. We want good buildings, right? So we want to make sure that process is reasonable. The implementation side, it really should work into the process of the local jurisdiction. They've got so many things to do from the building department. I don't know. I mean, I've gone through plan review. I've had building inspections done. They've got a lot of hats going on, many times kind of reduced staff. And so we want to make sure our implementation fits into that process so it can be easily done. And we're not creating an ordinance that requires like 3 more FTEs to make it happen. That's not, we want to think about something that's feasible. And not kind of burdensome on the implementation side. And then of course on the operational side, some of that comes from the cost effectiveness, where when we're saying like, is this a good standard, right? Is it going to increase the cost of operation? But we do want to think about that. We want to make sure that the folks who will be working in that building, living in that building, it can be operated, affordably. All right. So a couple of considerations. These are my last 2 slides for you. There's a lot here. I showed you 42 jurisdictions that have ordinances. Everyone's like, oh yeah, they're kind of the same. They're not the same. Everyone's got their kind of tweak and focus because it's based on the local nuances. Like, what's the history of that jurisdiction for above code legislation? That's gonna kind of direct a pathway, right? What's the appetite for it, the political will? What are the local industries? What's the level of development? What are the climate conditions? Even what are the economic conditions? I didn't mention this, but I was working with one jurisdiction where we were focusing on ADUs, because if we had all electric ADUs, that created secondary housing market. It allowed owners to build homes that they could rent because they were in an economic challenging, it was a very economically challenged city. So it got some income for folks. They created the all electric plan, so those could be distributed, so that reduced costs for the developers. So again, all of these things come into play as you think about what's the political conditions. Is there a will? What's the local investments? How can we make traction? What's the economics? I talked about that already. What's the social aspects? The aspects of the community, climate interests. What's my legal authority? Right? And what's the technical aspect of it? Is there enough market? Do we have the product availability? Do we have that selection? Or are we putting something in place that's going to be a barrier based on local availability or something like that? So again, we can think about those things. And last slide, I think wrapping up here. Just kind of approach. These aren't necessarily kind of the order you take, but I would say know your why. Why are you doing this? What's the goal? I think knowing your why, you'll be able to say that kind of clearly. That shows like the intent, the passion, the goal, and you can cater that and kind of tweak it to different audiences, right? To kind of capture them. Just take a step, even if it's not perfect, even if it's not, everything you want it to be, it moves in the direction and you can iterate over time, right? Create partnerships. Mike's going to talk about this, but you need, as advocates outside of jurisdictions, we can support them, right? We want to be supportive. We want to be partners with them, and we need that internal champion to be successful. We want to leverage the adoption code process. I talked about that. Define that pathway for continued progress. It doesn't have to be like, this is it. right? Code adoptions every 3 years. Education engagement is key. There's a lot we're all learning right now. So take the time, engage people, educate, and create those partnerships. Make sure you measure to show the impact. That's how we know we're doing a good job, and we can prove it so then we can keep doing more and better and iterate. And advocate for alignment of goals, whether it's state goals, whether it's programs, whether it's incentives. When we have that alignment, things make it a lot easier for folks to navigate, and it reduces, I would say, kind of like pushback overall. So hopefully I didn't go too long. And with that, I hope that sets up Mike for you to give us your story.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Amy. Great stuff, both Doug and Amy. I'm going to stop my video so nothing goes, you guys can't see me panicking while I'm trying to share my screen here. I'm going to give you a local perspective now. It's local, so it's not going to be as technical, and the slides are certainly not going to be as beautiful, but yeah, here we go. So, want to talk about City of Carlsbad's alternative water heating ordinance and our venture into reach codes. So it all starts with policy. Let's see here. Let me try and get this going here. There we go. So it all starts with policy, and Carlsbad underwent a community visioning process back in the early 2010s, and sustainability arose as one of the community vision core values. And as a result, Carlsbad, in their general plan element update, adopted a sustainability general plan element. So that was huge because it established a policy whereby you can tier off of any conversations. Policy documents, as I'm sure a lot of you know, are key to understanding how to begin and frame any kind of conversation you want to have with the elected officials and even upper management. We also adopted a climate action plan along with that general plan update, and it served as a CEQA tiering document. So this basically allowed public and private developers who are doing projects subject to the California Environmental Quality Act to use the GHG emissions reduction strategies of the climate action plan and just comply with the cap instead of having to do their own GHG analysis. So that was really a big incentive for us to do that. And it's got a number of measures in there, but that follow essentially 5 different strategy areas: energy efficiency, renewable energy, transportation, which is both reducing the number of trips, like trying to do commuting or alternative modes, but then also, as Amy and Doug were talking about, EVs, trying to reduce emissions from tailpipes. We've also got water, and public outreach and education is a huge one. So the area that I'm going to talk about now is the alternative water ordinance, the water heating ordinance, and that intersects with both energy efficiency and renewable energy, as we'll see. So it's Measure J in our CAP, and it's called the solar water heater and heat pump installation. Our CAP has reduction goals for 2020 and 2035. So our 2035 goal is to have solar water heaters and heat pumps in all new residential and non-residential buildings, and then up to 30% of the existing buildings be retrofitted. And as Amy mentioned, trying to get reach codes for building retrofits right off the bat is a very difficult, it's a difficult challenge. So you'll see our ordinance just targets new buildings. Our GHG reduction is only about 2,800 metric tons. That was originally 11,000 metric tons when we first did our CAP. But last year we amended our CAP to include clean energy, community choice aggregation, which means by 2030 we'll have 100% clean energy on the grid. As soon as you do that, energy efficiency and renewable energy CAP measures are not as effective when you're talking about GHG emissions. So I'll get into, that touches on the co-benefits, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So our ordinance development is pretty much like any other ordinance development. You look to see what other jurisdictions have done, you figure out where you want to have your parameters, you design the ordinance to reach the goal, in which case this was the GHG reductions. The unique part when you're going into energy areas is that you have to do a cost-effectiveness study, obviously engage the public, and then based on all that input, you put together a finalized recommendation to the City Council. So Amy mentioned the cost-effectiveness studies for the CEC. I agree. There's certain days that it's fun to read those and certain days when, oh my goodness. But they are required for all code amendments. From a staff perspective, especially folks that have not engaged in REACH codes, they are highly technical and they're new or completely unknown to jurisdictions. I mean, I've heard folks that were embarking on REACH code efforts and only to find out that they had to do this cost effectiveness study. They were thinking pie in the sky GHG reductions and they weren't able to get there because it just wasn't cost effective. So it does require outside resources for the city and or tearing off of some of these existing studies. And as you saw, there's a lot of studies out there, and we'll give you some resources for local energy codes that can help you know which existing studies are out there. The one nice thing though, from a staff perspective, is that it defines those two areas. It sets an upper boundary that say, hey, we can't go any further than this, with regard to GHG emissions, but we can still go to this level and have it cost effective. So it does help with the conversation there. So what does our ordinance actually do? It requires all new construction to have either a heat pump water heater, electric tankless, some other kind of electric heating. And interestingly enough, it needs to be paired with solar voltaic system, some kind of PV system. It turns out it was not cost effective if it's standing alone. And also the solar water heating area was not cost effective. So we had to combine this with photovoltaics. Luckily, we were also doing a REACH code at the same time, which required new commercial to have PV. So we could pair it with this water heating ordinance, and that worked. We didn't have a residential PV code, so we had to delay until the state PV mandate came into effect to make this ordinance effective. The implementation, Amy mentioned coordinating with development services, building division, consultant, absolutely critical. And all of these verbs are in the present tense because you can't just do it once. It's an ongoing process to coordinate with these folks. They are the frontline folks. They know what's going on, and unless they're on board, it's not going to go as smoothly. Applicability and exceptions. People are always going to come up with new scenarios, and you need to keep refining that applicability, refining those exceptions. There is a standard building code exception where someone can go to the building official for a hardship, but you really need to start defining what is hardship and what isn't. Establishing a monitoring system is important, but also establishing the capacity to keep that monitoring system going. You could say, oh, it's simple, just check a few more boxes, but I mean, with the flurry of building permits coming in over the counter, checking a few more boxes could actually make it, be that difference. And then always explore opportunities for the ordinance improvement. Like Amy said, just check, just make sure you're keeping track of that, and if there's political will, go further. So for those of you that are staff out there, some of the takeaways, it was really helpful for us that that mandate for REACH code was included in the policy documents. It gave us cover. We could say, hey, we're just implementing what the council's already told us to do. That was very helpful. Consulting early with the statewide REACH codes program team. And I think Doug will have the references in the resources. Fantastic efforts. They were very, very helpful in guiding us through the process. There's a lot of other jurisdictions up in the Northern California that have done this already, so that was helpful. Being flexible and creative. You can set out thinking that your code's going to do one thing, but it's probably going to end up doing something else. So be prepared for that and be creative. The cost effectiveness study, as I said, helps with outreach on both aspects and coordinating early with permit processing. Most importantly, maintain your enthusiasm, especially if this is the first REACH code you're taking through. You're going to have obstacles inside and outside the organization. And if you're the champion, just keep smiling and keep plugging along. As far as for the public, Amy touched on this really well, knowing your jurisdiction. You can't waltz into a jurisdiction that's relatively conservative, that doesn't really have sustainability policies, and say, oh, well, look at all these towns up in the Bay Area that have done this, you should do it too. So especially when it's the first time out of the gate. Expanding on co-benefits, both Doug and Amy talked about this. This is especially important now that a lot of jurisdictions in the San Diego region are going to be under a community choice aggregation. As I mentioned, the importance of energy efficiency and renewable energy in their GHG reduction equation has been reduced once that energy on the grid becomes completely clean. So focusing on those co-benefits will allow the conversation to keep happening about why you actually need a building code to take care of this. Highlighting the available assistance. There's a lot of help out there for staff, but they may not know about it. So the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative is a great organization that can provide assistance to them and collaboration and discussions. The statewide Reach Codes program I talked about as well. And San Diego Green Building Council has a lot of technical information that can help with staff. And then seeking partnerships, I think, is probably one of the most crucial there. You need to establish a relationship, obviously. So coming in, telling staff what they need to do, telling electeds what they need to do, rather than saying, hey, I've done a lot of research, here's some information, let's start the conversation. Or let's do a joint pilot project. I was just approached by an organization that wanted to do an induction stovetop loan program. And they said, we'll run the program, we'll do everything. Are you willing to promote it? And then, oh, by the way, could we maybe use a little place in your library or in your community centers, so we can actually have a place that people can come to. Starting a relationship, simple as that, really, really helps. So that's what I have, and wanted to make sure we have enough time for questions. So that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, and thank you for all our presenters today. So next up, we will move on to some Q&A comments, and Pia and Shayla, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for all those awesome presentations. Great and so informational. So the first question that we have is for Doug. So Doug, you talked a lot about the different pathways toward electrification. Why do you think the cities and communities in San Diego and the surrounding area, San Diego County, are farther behind?
That's a good question. I think the leadership from Northern California is, well, let's see. San Diego, I think, has a little bit less interest in leading on this topic. I think there has been some great local examples historically from Chula Vista and certainly now with Carlsbad. But generally the kind of more progressive approach to policymaking has been Northern California. So we kind of just, haven't really been as direct in some of this leadership. And I do think some of the presence of SDG&E and SEMPRA here has slowed down some of our local efforts as well. In Northern California, PG&E has been even supportive of the Berkeley natural gas ban, for example. So it's a little different political landscape. It's a little different advocacy landscape. It's a little different just sensibility. And I've lived in the Bay Area in the past, and it has a little different feel about how we approach things. And maybe it's just because it's always like nice here weather-wise that we just kind of lose focus sometimes. But I don't know. It's a bit speculative, but yeah.
Can I add two things to that?
Yeah.
Cool. One, I was going to say it's always nice down there, right? So then some of the cost effectiveness studies kind of limit capacity in milder climates, right? So to that cost effectiveness study that you need behind you, you may not have it as for everything you want, right? In the milder climate. So that's often a challenge we see. The other I would say is there's still a lot of work that's happening up in Northern California to kind of push this electrification effort forward. But I think folks have been working on reach codes in Northern California for decades. And so I think you have kind of some jurisdictional capacity, or at least knowledge and awareness, as well as community awareness, as well as developers have already kind of been rung through this process before. And so I think that allows things to move ahead a little bit more as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And we have another question directed towards Doug, but of course, panel, feel free to jump in. So Dwight had a question about challenges to gas moratorium ordinances. Have any ordinances been challenged in court and upheld? think we're getting a little technical difficulties.
Doug just freeze.
Yeah, I think he did.
And
I can
he's
hear you.
thinking a lot about it.
Yeah, I'm really stuck. Can you hear me at all?
Yes.
I can hear you now.
Okay. So yeah, there are active lawsuits happening. The California Restaurant Association just filed or updated a lawsuit for the city of Berkeley. The Berkeley city attorney is pretty confident that they have the Constitution. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, there are active lawsuits.
Oops.
Oh
Yeah.
boy.
Oh no.
I'll pick up a little bit while we wait for Doug to get back on. So there is an active lawsuit with the Restaurant Association in Berkeley. There's also a couple in Northern California. Oh, there he is. In Windsor and Santa Rosa. And I think he's on mute. Are you there, Doug?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
Not sure when
I
that
was
came out.
I was filling the time for you, but just calling
Thanks.
out Berkeley and then Santa Rosa and Windsor.
Yeah.
As two folks, and I think Santa Rosa it's underway right now, so there's nothing resolved at this point, but
Yeah.
I think looking favorable
Yeah.
for the jurisdiction.
Yeah, the cities that have led on that front have had a pretty good legal analysis behind it before it went down. There were a lot of preliminary conversations around the authority to do this and what were the right levers. And I think, so far it's held up. There is a current filing, the California Restaurant Association against the City of Berkeley. And it is, the question of standing has come up, whether or not the Restaurant Association actually even has standing to file suit. And there's pretty clear constitutional authority, according to the interpretation by the city attorney for Berkeley, that this is very much in their constitutional power, to be determined.
Thank you so much for speaking on that. And another question for the panel in general. Andrew asked a question related to the utility side of the conversation. Is there any indication yet of SDG&E's view on all electric construction reach code / ordinances?
That may be a broader question to some of the other advocates on the call. They are, of course, supporting the statewide reach code IOU established localreachcodes.org and the Energy Code ACE efforts, including the funding of the cost-effectiveness studies, partially because that's the statewide approach and program, and they're bought into that. I would say from a local advocacy standpoint, I haven't seen any favorable statements from them on it, but others may be aware of it. And it's hard to know what's happening behind the scenes. I'm pretty sure this is being recorded. So that's maybe as much as I'll say there.
Thank you. Yes, agreed. If anyone else has more input there, feel free to jump in. If not, I'll move on to the next question. So for the panel, from Elaine, what percentage of San Diego single housing units meets all electric?
I'm going to say it's probably in the 10% range. We're talking San Diego County as a whole. That's a guess. There are some data on this that could be pulled forward, but there are portions, I know that even within the city of San Diego, there are entire communities and subdivisions that didn't have gas established. So I would bet it's as high as 10% countywide, if anyone's got better information there, but we can maybe send it to our technical group and see if we can figure that out, or our research group and figure that out.
Thanks, definitely. Yeah, we'll make sure to save that for the technical forum. All right, so we have another really good question from Dwight. Any advice for a city like Del Mar, which is very built out and sees very limited new construction? Any sweet spot to start the BE process there?
I'm gonna ask Mike to answer that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think because then you're talking about existing retrofits, and that's actually going to be a consumer choice. So focusing in on the co-benefits, on the health. Del Mar is pretty sustainable community. I mean, they've done a lot of good stuff with their cap implementation and such. So I would definitely go there. Unfortunately, to one of Doug's points, the getting rid of the cooking is sometimes the most passionate area that people don't want to get rid of. They don't know where their water or their air is being heated, but the cooking part. However, the cooking part is also kind of one of the easier ways to get into on consumer basis, because the induction hot plates are so cool. They even have some that shine blue lights along the edge so you can see the flame, the pseudo flame. So that's a good way to get folks learning that they don't need to have natural gas in their life. So
Mike,
that might be an approach.
Would your water heater approach be something that's maybe more palatable as in a retrofit situation?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. But the one thing is you need to remember it needs to be tied to PV. So if they have existing PV and they can accommodate it, then great. Yeah. And then you could probably even tier off of our cost-effectiveness study at that point.
Thank you.
One thing I'll add into is sometimes, even if you don't have much new construction, sometimes just passing an ordinance, even if it's going to touch a small amount, creates kind of momentum in buying. You don't have the resistance and it gets through, and then people are willing to kind of explore and take something on the next time. So that's also the way to do it. They're also, depending on what you have, some people are like, we don't have any new construction. I was like, yeah, well, that tear down is really new construction. Yeah. So I've seen jurisdictions who say we're adopting a new construction ordinance, and if you're touching 50% of the exterior walls and changing the HVAC, then this will also apply too. So those are just, and I would agree. I think the water heater, I think Mike's water heater strategy or some like single appliance might also be a good tactic too.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much for your awesome input, everyone. And so for the panel in general, what are your recommended talking points for city staff to get started on this effort?
I think we touched on a few of them. The health aspect is usually a very important one, especially when it's coming from community members. That's a really big driver. The overall safety message, I think, is important as well. And then, there's some details in it, but the cost aspect too is an important one. So especially where you can not have the installation of gas infrastructure, that's going to be your biggest cost driver. So depending on the context and what kind of policy you're speaking to, but the personal health aspects and safety issues are the ones I think that are really important. Those seem to resonate the most. Remember, you're dealing with different layers of staff too. There's the sort of sustainability staff where a climate message will resonate as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, it's the partnership stuff. So, hey, this is really important to me in the community, and I'm here to help you help us. So yeah, that's big.
Thank you so much. And then a question here for anyone that might be able to answer it. Are appliance manufacturers on board with building electrification in general? And if not, any suggestions for how to get them on board?
Which ones? Yeah.
Well, I think that generally speaks to the fact that, if you want everyone to go into, heat pump, water heaters or space heaters, or even induction stovetops, there needs to be the supply if we drive up the demand.
Well, and I'll add to Mike, I posted that question, the consumer impressions when they're making decisions about their home and home management and appliances. How, I guess maybe the question was, what's the lag time on the information that's presented when you're at purchase decision? Because it's a large scale momentum from consumer interest and confidence of the decisions they're making.
Yeah, so use a couple of maybe data points here. So about 85% of like hot water heaters, for example, are replaced on burnout, right? And I think Elaine, if I understand your question, it's about existing buildings, not a new construction reach code necessarily, but consumer choice. So if you go to a hardware store now, a big box, and you want to buy a hot water heater, you'll have a couple of options. And on the box, it'll have a statement about what the energy costs will be. Well, if you look at those now, even at Lowe's or Home Depot or wherever, you'll find the cheapest one on the retail shelf from an operating cost is going to be your heat pump water heater. And that's just using the national average electricity and gas costs and run hours. And it says it right there on the box. This is your cheapest option, right? So the question is, what does it take in your home to get it done? And that's the bigger challenge, or can be the bigger challenge. So that's a kind of a lot of work that needs to be done. And that's where even like some reach codes on like pre-wiring, other aspects of like getting your building ready to be electrified. So sometimes panel upgrades, some other pieces are needed. But in terms of the consumer choice, there are options available, like the manufacturers are on board with this in some ways. To use another example, there's a couple of manufacturers now have come out with 120 volt hot water heaters, heat pump hot water heaters, which is meant to plug in without needing to run a 240 volt outlet to your hot water heater. So it's like a more compliant, like they're building that specifically for California, right? That doesn't have a market anywhere else. And so, yeah, they're on board with this. And there is a broader consumer campaign that's happening statewide now that will work its way to Southern California, called The Switch Is On, which is going to be about informing consumer choice. And that is actually supported by manufacturers as part of that coalition as well. So, so I do think the manufacturers are on board. Consumer information is needed. Some of the pre-work is still a big part of it, though.
The one thing I'll also just add on to that too is I'm working on a project where we're electrifying a whole block. Yeah. And one of the participants, their water heater went out, and they called me. They're like, Amy, what am I going to do? What do I tell? I got to call the plumber. I need it replaced. What's the spec? And they called the plumber, and they're like, you want a what?
Yeah.
And she's like, I want a heat pump water heater. And I'm like, no, those things don't work. I don't know what you're talking about. And so I will say there's product out there. It's performing well, from heat pump water heaters to induction ranges to induction burners to, you know, great space conditioning equipment. And we've got manufacturers producing it. We're getting more into California. We're seeing the consumer campaign, but we also have our industry. And so we need to make sure that folks can walk in. I can go to Rubenstein, my plumbing distributor right here, and it's right there available. I see it, I know it, I can grab it, and I can install it. I mentioned SB 1477. It's this $200 million over 4 years to invest in market transformation. It's training, it's incentives, but it's training and educating the industry. So when somebody calls up and it's like, hey, my water heater just conked out, I need a new one as soon as possible, we're getting the product we need. So yes, there's product there. Yes, there's still a ways to go. And that's why I would say education engagement is required all along the way.
And there are a lot of good examples taken from the EV electric vehicle realm about all the different areas that you needed to touch to really get that market transformed. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Awesome. Well, we really appreciate that. And that is pretty much it for our discussion questions. The technical ones from the chat we've saved, and we'll make it into the technical forms. And then I think Doug had a point to make. So I'll pass it to Doug. Thanks.
Yeah,
Doug.
I was just going to bring up some of the final resources, which actually touch on some of the questions as well. So just to kind of walk through the Building Decarb Coalition, they're the ones developing the Switch Is On campaign that we discussed. Can you guys see my screen, I assume, or no?
No, you're not sharing yet.
Not yet.
Why? There's an extra step there. Good. How about now?
Yes.
Good. So the Building Decarb Coalition is the group that's sort of developed the Switch Is On campaign. The Peninsula Clean Energy, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, there's a ton of stuff there, some technical assistance resources as well. We'll talk through that. I'll show some examples of that in a moment. The IOU reach codes that Mike talked a lot about, local energy codes has been a part of. So really great resources kind of throughout. On that Peninsula reach code, you'll see stuff in there about staff meetings, other aspects of that, some of the other cost effectiveness studies. The SB 1477 that Amy mentioned, there's two aspects to it. One relates to new construction, one is for retrofits. And this is a sample staff meeting. They talked about layering incentives. We're looking at potential incentives for new construction in the like maybe up to $12,000, depending on what that looks like. But you'd be stacking your like base incentives from kind of development and then specific appliance incentives, then looking at other technologies as well, potentially a part of that. So this is a bit of a hypothetical model or an illustrative model. On the retrofit side, same idea. You start with your base statewide incentives. There'd be this tech program that Amy mentioned, and then maybe some SGIP, which is a part of the self-generation program. So looking at some potential real dollars coming out in statewide for appliances. Mike mentioned the importance of the climate collaboratives, which is a big one. So things to like look for and places to go for resources. And then it was mentioned the statewide reach code. So they maintain a pretty detailed database of all of the reach code options, including the cost studies. And so I'll highlight Carlsbad here just real quick. And it summarizes and you can download the actual documents associated with it as well about the cost-effective approach. But the good news is, you know, for San Diego County, lower incremental cost and positive annual bill savings, you know, these are immediate payback type measures. And I think that's where I'll end. It was mentioned already, but the Green Building Council will be administering a induction cooktop loaner program. And I'll stop sharing. And I think Marie is going to bring it home.
Yes, thank you so much, Doug. Before I share my screen, I'd like to take the opportunity to maybe take a group photo of us. So if you would like to share your video, that'd be great.
There's no way my bandwidth is going to hold up.
Okay, let's see. More people are sharing. Get yourself all gussied up. Okay, fantastic. So it'll be on the count of 3. Do a wave or a high five or thumbs up. Give me something crazy. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much. Okay, and let me just pop this up real quick. My dog says hello. Okay, so in addition to the call to action that Amy presented, we have a few more here. I'm going to put some information into chat for you. So again, the presentations will be provided to you guys in a couple of days, and the recording of this webinar will be available on the SDBEC YouTube channel in a couple of days as well. Again, we provide the form to submit technical questions. And for other calls of action, the first step to do is maybe register to attend San Diego 350's Policy Advocacy 101 training, part 2. This training will cover things like letters to the editors, reaching out to your elected officials, and a couple of other topics. So that's, I'm sure many of you would find that informational. Another thing that you can always do in your own time is reach out to your elected officials to meet with them and advocate for building electrification. You can also be on the lookout for your local city council or environmental commission meetings that address either the climate action plan or building electrification. And I would even say if they're talking about a climate emergency declaration, those are all great subjects to hone in on and advocate for building electrification. So you can do that by making a public comment during the meeting or submit a written comment. For videos that covers how to make public comments and meetings with elected officials, I've included the link for the recording of the Policy Advocacy 101 training part 1. So all that information is available to you. Again, we will send everything via email to you guys within the next few days. I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that you found this webinar useful. Big round of virtual applause for our speakers, Doug Cott, Amy Dryden, and Mike Grimm. And I also want to thank the entire team that helped put together this webinar. Everybody put in a lot of hard work, and it's been a great experience for us. And we hope that you have enjoyed our presentation today.
Yay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Well,
wonderful
Thanks, all.
presentations. Loved
Yeah.
it.
Hey, sorry, Doug. I totally forgot about the resources.
it's all good. We worked it out.
Yeah.